Day. A few programs ago, I talked about a panic sweeping Europe and the fact that, as somebody who's experienced in detecting signs of panic, I could see the evidence of it in all the various statements and actions that various political leaders in Europe were taking, specifically and most pertinently Emmanuel Macron. And I have to say that as more information starts to pour in, it is clear that the levels of panic are in fact growing, and as tends to happen when panic takes hold, we see recrimination, anger, people pointing fingers at each other, and as well as all of that, a general descent into total madness. I say total madness because how else to describe this utterly bizarre conversation between German military officers discussing an attack on the Kerch bridge. Now, there's a few points to make about this conversation. The first is to concede an error that I made in my program yesterday. I assumed, based on second-hand accounts, incomplete accounts of this conversation, that what these two German officers were discussing was a British and Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge with Storm Shadow missiles. And I ought to say that the Storm Shadow was used again by the Ukrainians and the British in a major strike that took place yesterday. Apparently, multiple Storm Shadow missiles were launched by Ukrainian Sukhoi 24 aircraft, all directed towards Crimea. I'm not sure whether any of them were focused on the Kerch Bridge itself. The Russians claim that all of the missiles were shot down, and that they also claim that two aircraft, a Sukhoi 24 and a MiG 29, were also shot down over the course of this attack. Now, before I continue, I should say that there has been much discussion about the various Ukrainian claims over the last few weeks about the numbers of Russian aircraft that they say they have shot down. I remain massively skeptical about these Ukrainian claims. I'm not saying that no Russian aircraft at all have been shot down, but as I discussed in my program yesterday, it seems to me that if Russian aircraft losses were as heavy as the Ukrainians say, then there would surely be some reduction in Russian bombing attacks on the front line, not because the Russians would be short of aircraft, but because they would presumably be taking steps to pull their aircraft back until they found a solution to the problem. The fact that the Russians are conducting bombing attacks across Ukraine, at least on the front lines, at the same intensity as we have seen throughout this year and the last months of last year, suggests to me that the attacks, the Ukrainian attempts to shoot down Russian aircraft have been largely unsuccessful, and that most of these Ukrainian claims of shooting down Russian aircraft are unreliable. That's my view. But anyway, point is, even as people are talking about Ukrainian claims to have shot down Russian aircraft, very few people have been talking about Russian claims about the Ukrainian aircraft that the Russians say they have been shooting down. Now, by way of illustration, over the course of last week, the Russians claimed that they shot down 2 Ukrainian MiG-29s, and 1 Sukhoi 25 ground attack aircraft. And of course, they now claim that they've shot down a MiG-29 and a Sukhoi 24. So that would be 5 Ukrainian jet-powered aircraft, 3 fighter jets, 3 MiG-29s, and 2 bomber-type aircraft, a Sukhoi 24 and a Sukhoi 25, over a period of around 10 days. Just saying. So let's just bear that fact in mind. But anyway, we've seen a major Ukrainian attack on Crimea using Storm Shadow missiles. I've now got a much better understanding of how complicated and difficult these attacks are. Rowan Beletic has been pointing this out many times, and we now know how long it takes to program and prepare the Storm Shadows for launch, and Olaf Scholz has blurted out the fact that this is being done by British technicians. I think that's essentially British and French technicians. That's essentially what he said. British technicians for the Storm Shadows, French technicians for the Scalp missiles, which are very similar but not identical to the Storm Shadows. Anyway, this latest attack appears to have failed. I assumed that the German officers were talking about a similar Ukrainian stroke British attack on the Kerch Bridge, and it is indeed the case that the British have an idée fixe about the Kerch Bridge, much as the Ukrainians themselves do. Whenever there's any kind of attack on the Kerch Bridge, the British media is full of it. It's always presented as some kind of Ukrainian triumph, which is difficult to understand. We'll come to that shortly. And furthermore, we've been getting reports today in the British media essentially conceding an awful lot about what we've just been learned from Olaf Scholz about the role that the British have been playing in the Storm Shadow attacks on land targets in Russia and in the zone of the special military operation. But we now learn that the British have also been heavily involved in the various attacks and strikes on Russian warships in the Black Sea, with no less a person than Admiral Radakin intimately involved in all of these attacks. Now, again, just spinning off a bit on a tangent, I'm going to make my own observations again about these attacks, which is that they have been largely unsuccessful, despite the many claims that you see to the contrary. The British and the Ukrainians may possibly have destroyed a Russian missile corvette, a Tarantul missile corvette from the 1980s, rather an elderly ship. They may probably have destroyed a number of Russian amphibious landing ships, but they have completely failed in their various attempts to destroy the real ships, the ships that really form the operational core of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Makarov class destroyers or frigates, the submarines. There was a strike on one submarine that was in dock, but apparently the damage has been largely fixed, and it looks as if that particular submarine will be going back in service. And of course, the more modern Buyan class corvettes with long-range Kalibr missiles, the Ukrainians, and if you like the British, assuming their involvement, have been entirely unsuccessful in attacking those or striking any of those. They have managed to destroy possibly, probably, a number of old amphibious warfare ships. Unclear what their exact role is, perhaps to supply Crimea. But we'll come to that in a moment. Perhaps this is an elaborate plan to try to cut off Crimea from resupply. The idea is destroy the Kerch bridge, destroy these amphibious ships that are sometimes used to transport cargo as well. Perhaps that's the plan, but all that plan has now become redundant, and we'll come to that very shortly. But anyway, I assumed, as I said, that the Germans were talking about an attack by the British and the Ukrainians on the Crimean Bridge. As I said, they're obsessed with it, just as they've been obsessed with this, frankly, pointless campaign against the Black Sea Fleet, which, to my mind, has achieved virtually nothing. Well, it turns out otherwise. It's now quite clear, in fact, there's no doubt about it, reading the transcript itself, which I have done, reading third-party accounts of the transcript, which I have also done. I've had some incredibly helpful emails about this transcript. Anyway, reading about it, reading the transcript, listening to videos of the transcript, and reading what others have said about it, it's clearly a German plan together with the Ukrainians to try to attack the Kerch Bridge using Taurus missiles. And I'm going to say that it's fairly clear to me who is the sole begetter, in other words, the originator of this particular plan. About a week, 2 weeks ago, no less a person than Victoria Nuland turned up in Kiev. And this is clearly, as I said at the time, connected with the power struggle that was at that time underway between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. And it's clear also that she threw her backing behind Zelensky and perhaps ensured that any moves that were underway at that time to remove him from power were not seen through. And I suspect that it was this that bought Zelensky, the time and space to finally sack Zaluzhny. And then she came out and made some comments, some very strange comments in a press conference, brief press conference or press statement that she made, in which she said that she was confident about Ukraine's prospects and that the Russians could soon expect some nice surprises. And reports subsequently circulated that this was taking us back to a plan that I remember discussing in videos that I made last year, based on reports in the American media, which consisted of a new plan. Ukraine would create huge fortified lines comparable to the Russian Surovikin line. They would withdraw behind these lines and mount defenses against the Russians. And at the same time, they would launch missile strikes using long-range missiles against Russian targets, not just in the territory of 1991 Ukraine, but indeed in Russia itself, even territory that the West acknowledges is Russian. So that was Victoria Nuland's idea. She's almost certainly been intensively lobbying for it in Washington. We've had these reports that $4 billion have now been found, left over from the previous congressional appropriation. We're assured that it's the last $4 billion. The Pentagon has been very reluctant, or so we're told, to spend this money. But of course, there's never any shortage of money in Washington. You can always find a couple of $1 billion here or there that you can use for any particular plan that you want. But anyway, and as I've said in a program I made recently, it's fairly clear to me that the purpose of these $4 billion is to supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles, the long-range ATACMS missiles that Ukraine can then use to strike at Crimea and potentially even, perhaps just possibly, though I understand some say the range is too great, at pre-1991, or rather pre-2014 Russia as well. So there we go. That's the person who has been talking this up, lobbying for it, badgering the French, badgering the British, badgering the Germans especially, because what we know is that ATACMS missiles, long-range ATACMS missiles, are in short supply. The Pentagon needs them to maintain its defenses, as it would say, in the Indo-Pacific region. There's always been this tension about the supply of these missiles. The Pentagon isn't happy about that idea at all. They supplied a small number, about 20 ATACMS missiles previously, but these were shorter-ranged ATACMS missiles with cluster munitions. They're now being pushed to supply the longer-range missiles with the unitary warheads. It's possible some of these will be provided by Ukraine's European allies that have these missiles, but of course they will be looking for replacements from the United States. So ultimately, it will be a draw on the arsenal of these missiles from the United States. There will not be many of these missiles to send. So, which country has the long-range missiles that can strike within pre-2014 Russian boundaries, which can reach the Crimean Bridge and which can strike at Crimea itself? Well, Germany does, in the form of the Taurus missiles. And what we have had now is a discussion between two German generals discussing a German attack, a joint German-Ukrainian attack upon the Crimean Bridge. And why do we have all of these discussions now? Why is Emmanuel Macron talking about sending troops to Ukraine? Why is Estonia talking about the same thing? It's absolutely clear to me that the European powers and the United States see a rapidly deteriorating military situation in Ukraine. We will come to that later in this program. They understand that Ukraine needs weapons and men to turn this round, and almost certainly they've been told by their logistics people and their industrial people that these weapons, the shells, the air defense missiles, they can't be supplied in any quantity. There's an article today in Politico discussing the question of the F-16s, and it makes a point that's been made by many people. Brian Beletic has talked about this. I've talked about this. Many others have talked about this. People very well informed about aviation matters, which, by the way, I am not. Even if you can get the F-16s to Ukraine, even if you can train pilots, Ukrainian pilots, to the necessary competencies so that they can fly these planes and operate them effectively in combat, Ukrainian air bases are unsuitable for these planes. They are not built to American specifications. They are built to the much more rugged Soviet specifications. And illustrating, by the way, a fundamental problem with American military equipment. They are bases which function inside a war zone where the United States does not have unchallenged air superiority over the enemy. Now, this is something that Americans have never experienced at any time since 1943, a situation where the other side is able to contest the airspace in an effective way. And American aircraft have been designed on the assumption that they can operate from bases secure in the rear, which are not going to be under constant bombing and missile attack from the other side. So Politico acknowledges that there may be real problems and challenges operating the F-16s from Ukraine. And of course, we've had these other plans to base these aircraft in Romania and Poland that, as many have pointed out, would be potentially an act of war against Russia. It might invite Russian retaliation against those bases in Romania and Poland. But again, there is the problem that positions the F-16s some distance from the combat zone. It would mean that, even as I now understand, if it were to try and operate over Crimea, it would have range issues. It would have problems with range. And if we're talking about the Donbass, the fighting in the Donbass, to all intents and purposes, it would be beyond the F-16's range, or more properly, its radius of action. So, problems at many levels, not enough weapons, not enough equipment, Ukraine running out of men as well. No prospect of that being turned round to any degree. The F-16s, not well adapted to this combat zone, perhaps ineffectual. We've seen the problems with the Abrams tanks now, apparently 2 destroyed. We've seen the problems with the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys. And recently, Brian Belletti did an absolutely masterly program on the new Atlas, in which he discussed in the first part of the program and reminded everybody that he had correctly anticipated this right from the outset. He discussed a recent Pentagon report that it is proving impossible to maintain the equipment, the over-sophisticated, over-engineered, very complex equipment that the United States and the Western powers have been supplying to Ukraine, that it's proving impossible to maintain it in Ukrainian combat conditions. And again, this is something which many people, first and foremost, Brian Belletti himself, have discussed, and we see it, the case, the proof of it, in actual combat conditions. So, this desperate plan, create these fortified lines, except, apparently, work on these fortified lines is patchy. There is insufficient time. There are insufficient resources to do it. That's a matter I will discuss in a different program. And do the only thing that you think you can do and which you believe can make a difference, which is to supply Ukraine with long-range missiles in order to try to launch strikes against Crimea, isolate Crimea, perhaps launch more strikes against the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Not that you are actually achieving anything real by doing so. And of course, launch strikes into Russia itself, assuming that that is going to intimidate Putin. And we see that the Germans, as they always do, are now discussing whether rather how they can do it. And coming now to the gathering madness, let's turn to this transcript itself. Firstly, I have no doubt at all that it is authentic. It is clearly a discussion between two German officers. The way it is conducted makes it entirely clear to me that these are two real people engaged in an actual conversation. I understand that this is the consensus in the German media, and I also have received confirmation of this from various people who would know and have emailed me. So this is a genuine conversation which has clearly taken place at some point within the last couple of days or weeks. So that's the first thing to say. The second is that I have absolutely no doubt at all that it was the Russians who were listening into this conversation and who were recording it. And it's not difficult to see how that would have happened, because from what I can understand, one of these generals, one of the two people involved in this conversation, was speaking to the other from Singapore. And it's fairly obvious to me that he was speaking over an open telephone. In other words, there wasn't a proper scrambling or encryption device, or at least used, or if it was one that the Russians have clearly hacked, because they were listening into the conversation. And I find it incredible, I find it absolutely bizarre, if I've got this right, that two German officers would be discussing such a sensitive topic in this way. One would have thought that before they started chattering to each other, they would first have waited until one of them returned to Germany and they could have a proper, secure face-to-face meeting or use much more secure lines. It ought to be obvious that by this stage in this conflict, that Russian intelligence agencies will be keeping a very careful eye on the movements of senior NATO officials and will be listening into their call. Now, in saying this, by the way, I'm not disclosing any fact that won't have been worked out by the NATO officials themselves. I suspect that these two officers, will have been severely taken to task for this grotesque breach of security. But that, I am sure, is what has happened. There's been some wild rumours that this conversation has been leaked by the British in a spiteful response to Chancellor Scholz's disclosure that the British have been intimately involved in targeting of the Storm Shadow missiles. And there's even been some equally astonishing claims that no less a person than Chancellor Scholz or people close to him were responsible in leaking this conversation, and that the British and the Germans did that to the Russians, or perhaps some dissident faction within the German government or military leaked it to the Russians. Let me say clearly, I think that is inconceivable. I think such a thing is absolutely impossible. No one within the British or German government would do such a thing. And of course, doing a thing like that would expose whoever did it to criminal prosecution and a lengthy spell of imprisonment. And I think it is inconceivable that any political leader would authorize a leak in that form, because of course if they did, their own position would be in extreme political jeopardy. And frankly, I don't imagine any political leader exposing themselves to something like that. This call was clearly overheard, recorded, and published by the Russians, who must have been astonished that a conversation like this was being conducted over an insecure line. Now, that doesn't, by the way, mean that the Russians haven't managed to penetrate more secure lines. Maybe they're able to listen into all sorts of conversations. Maybe they have all kinds of spies all across NATO who are providing them with all kinds of sensitive information as well. Very, very likely. But I know nothing about that, and I'm not going to try and speculate or guess about it. In this case, this conversation took place over what was an obviously insecure line, and that is why the Russians had no inhibitions about publishing it, because they're not compromising any of their major intelligence collection facilities by doing so. So, why did the German officers do this? Why did they talk to each other in this bizarre and extraordinary way? Well, arrogance, hubris, incompetence, bungling, but I suspect also, and primarily, massive pressure from the politicians. The politicians are clearly putting intense pressure on the military, the German military, to make this happen. One senses that the key player here is the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius. He is a strong hawk. He wants clearly to pursue the conflict with Russia. He's obviously angling to replace Olaf Scholz, and he's been busy sedulously promoting himself as the strong man who can take over from Scholz and lead the German government in a strong direction. And Pistorius as well, and beyond that, is clearly under pressure from the likes of Victoria Nuland in the United States. So Pistorius probably has been putting pressure on the soldiers, and the soldiers are left trying to work out how to do this bizarre thing. Doing so, notwithstanding the fact that the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who is not only the head of the German government, but who is also Pistorius's boss within the German SPD, the Social Democratic Party, clearly has grave doubts about this idea. Anyway, what do we learn from this conversation itself? And here I'm going to say I've had a lot of help from the emails that I've received understanding this conversation. The first thing to say is that this is a complex weapon. Now, that has already been pointed out to me. It was pointed out to me a couple of days ago by one of my correspondents, and we see confirmation of this. This is an extremely complex weapon, the Taurus missile. It requires very careful programming. The Ukrainians would not be able to do this themselves. They would need to receive data about where the target is located. Well, of course, with the Crimean Bridge, that is not such a problem, in theory. But even then, in order to launch the missile from a proper launch point and have some confidence that it will strike at the target with the necessary degree of accuracy, that would require a lot of careful programming, which realistically the Ukrainians are not going to be able to achieve in any short period of time. I say that these two officers do remark upon the fact that the Ukrainians managed to get on top of the complex challenge of operating the air defense missiles the West has supplied more quickly than had been anticipated. I'm skeptical about that, by the way, for all kinds of reasons I'm not going to discuss in this program. But anyway, they did say that, but they nonetheless concede that in this case, to strike at the Crimean Bridge, they would need input, direct input from the Germans themselves. And instantly, there are problems, because it turns out that the bridge is an extremely difficult target. Hitting it would require very high levels of accuracy indeed, and as it is a very large and powerful structure, around 20 missiles would be needed in order to damage it or destroy it beyond hope of repair. And we come up against the immediate problems because initially, at least, the total number of missiles that could be supplied to Ukraine, Taurus missiles, which could be supplied to Ukraine, would be no more than 50. Perhaps another 50 could be sent later, but sending more would compromise the entire arsenal, the viability of the Taurus missile arsenal held by Germany itself, and that would jeopardize Germany's own military position and its ability to fulfill its NATO obligations. So if you had to use 20 missiles out of 50 to destroy the bridge, well, that would already be a challenge. But of course, in practice, you would have to launch far more missiles than that, especially if your plan was to destroy the bridge with one big strike. You would probably need at least 50 missiles in order to build in some redundancy. Not all of the missiles that you launch would hit the target, even if there was no air defense system that needed to be got through. And bluntly, if you were going to do it launching all the missiles in one go, you would probably have to launch all the missiles at once. Now, that would mean that you'd get rid of your missiles pretty much immediately, all your 50 Taurus missiles in one big strike. And there are already problems because apparently the carrier aircraft that Ukraine has for launching these missiles, the Sukhoi 24s, as of the time that this conversation took place, are down to single digits. The Russians have been methodically destroying them, and there are fewer and fewer of these aircraft left. Now, let's say that there's 7, and I think this is probably an optimistic number, actually. I've heard other reports suggesting that it's as few as 4. But let's say it's 7. 7 Sukhoi 24s could only launch perhaps 14 of these missiles at one go. So already you have further problems. I'm just saying, you don't have the aircraft with which to launch these missiles. Now, the officers do say that the F-16s that Ukraine is going to receive could be adapted to do that. But as has been pointed out to me by one of my correspondents, this has never actually been done, so it would require time to adapt the F-16 to do this. But of course, the F-16 anyway is not going to be delivered and become operational in June. And we've already discussed the problems with operating F-16s. So this whole scheme begins to look rather far-fetched, because it's unlikely that the Ukrainians could launch 50 missiles at the Kerch bridge at one time. They might be able to launch fewer numbers of missiles over several days or weeks. But then, of course, we run into the other problem, which is that the Kerch bridge is very heavily protected by Russian air defense systems. And the Taurus is a difficult missile to shoot down. It has a high subsonic speed. It operates at very low altitudes. It would not be an easy missile to shoot down, at least in theory. But the same was said about the Storm Shadows. They operate in some ways in similar ways, and the Russians have found ways of shooting down the Storm Shadows, as we have just seen. The specific problem, anyway, with attacking the Kerch Bridge is that it is a relatively small target. And that means that the Russians, knowing that it would be attacked, would be in a position to establish very strong air defenses around it. They would know that the missiles are coming. They would know a great deal about the nature of these missiles because open sources are full of it. They would have reasonably clear ideas of where the missiles would be coming from. They would know about their range. They would know about the bases where the aircraft that carry these missiles are located. They would be able, with their defenses, with confidence, to shoot down a fair proportion of the missiles that were launched against the bridge, which is why, presumably, you would need several missiles, large numbers of missiles, launched at once in order to shoot it, in order to have a realistic hope of getting through. Already this plan looks complicated. I'm not saying that, human ingenuity being what it is, something can't eventually be done. Perhaps it can, but it's a complicated plan. It would require a huge amount of resources. And this is the other point. The German generals are saying to each other, what ultimately is the purpose of it? The Russians have built the land bridge, have the land bridge to Crimea. They build road and railway links to Crimea. The generals discuss this fact. The Kerch Bridge has now become redundant. It would obviously be useful in civilian times to keep civil traffic moving along the bridge. But before long, all of the military supplies will no doubt be trundling to Crimea along the railways and the roads, which are much safer. So what is the point of this? In fact, putting that aside, if this is a surprise attack on the bridge is launched in this way, it is not inconceivable that if civilian traffic is crossing the bridge when it happens, then a lot of civilians might be killed to no useful military purpose, and that would be embarrassing. Anyway, let's put that aside. It's maybe a far-fetched possibility. Perhaps there's arguments against it happening. Who knows? But the point is, the generals themselves agree that this would be essentially a PR stunt. Brian Beletic, in one of his recent videos, actually said this, that Ukraine is increasingly engaging in public relations stunts. And the attack on the Kerch Bridge which the British are so keen on, which the Americans are so keen on, at least Victoria Nuland is, that Boris Pistorius apparently wants information about, it would be a stunt as well. Incredibly and very alarmingly, the generals instead discuss an alternative option, which is to strike at Russian targets in Krasnodar region, that is in pre-2014 Russia. And, well, one obvious place would be the Russian military headquarters from which the special military operation is being conducted, which is in the city of Rostov-on-Don. I have to say, I find all of this astonishing and deeply disturbing, but there it is. So, a crazy plan, perhaps an unfeasible plan, or a plan which is feasible, or a plan which is only at the very limit of the feasible, one which would be very costly and expensive to execute. It would probably use up a significant part of Germany's limited stock of Taurus missiles, and which the generals who are talking about it agree would be nothing more than a PR stunt. Because in terms of military supplies, the Kerch bridge has become redundant. The same, by the way, is true of all of these ships, amphibious ships, that Admiral Radakin supposedly has been targeting. Most Russian supplies to Crimea will, before long, be reaching Crimea by land. And as for the Russian forces in Kherson and Zaporozhye, they will also be supplied, presumably, through these railway lines. So, a crazy plan altogether, the kind of crazy plan which desperate, panicky people come up with. And it's not just the Germans who are coming up with these crazy plans. We can see how Scholz is trying to push back. He's talking about how the British can do this thing, but we can't, we in Germany can't do this. I've discussed how this has created a huge row with the British, who are furious about this. Tobias Elwood, the British MP, is incandescent, publicly incandescent about this breach of security. I find it interesting, by the way, that no one in Britain is denying the truth of what Olaf Scholz said. No one in France is denying the truth of what Olaf Scholz is saying. On those topics, let me repeat a point that I've made many times. Sending an armed man across a country's border is an act of war. Launching missiles, participating in the launch of missiles in this kind of detailed way against Russian warships and Russian bridges, and discussing strikes inside Russia itself in Krasnodar region is an act of war also. If Germany is not involved, is not at war with Russia, then it has no business launching missile strikes inside Russian territory, even if it does so under the thin disguise that it is the Ukrainians who are doing it. This never happened at any point during the Cold War. The Soviets and the Americans regularly armed proxy forces against each other. The Soviets participated in the fighting in Korea. Their pilots flew MiG-15 fighter jets disguised as Koreans, and their technicians also helped operate North Vietnamese air defense missiles. The Americans provided a great deal of technical support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and some of their people undoubtedly were involved in Afghanistan itself. But at no point during the Cold War did either the Soviets or the Americans conduct strikes or participate in strikes conducted against the actual national territory of the other. What is being discussed here is off the scale. It is a straightforward act of war, and to talk about it, as Victoria Nuland apparently does, and Boris Pistorius apparently may also be doing, and as these generals are talking about it as well, with respect to the attacks on Krasnodar region, is crazy, given that we're talking about an enormously powerful country, Russia, which is the world's most powerful nuclear power. It is off the scale, mad. But it gets worse, because we've had this complicated, protracted, bizarre debate in France from President Macron of France about the need to send European troops to Ukraine. And it's quite clear that most European states are not keen on this idea at all, combat troops to Ukraine. We've seen there have been opinion polls in France itself. 68% of the French public, according to Le Figaro, are solidly opposed to this idea. And I'm going to make a guess. I think that most of the French military must oppose this plan too. I think they understand that if we're talking about the French military itself, it is not configured for participation in a conflict like the one in Ukraine. It is relatively small. Many of the troops are indeed very highly trained, but the equipment is relatively light. And in a territory where the Russians have missile dominance, simply sending French troops anywhere near the combat line invites losses and the return of body bags to France, perhaps in large quantities, in a way that this time, given that this would be a public deployment, would be impossible to conceal. Now, that brings me to the Russian reaction. About the missile strikes, we've had a clear response from President Putin himself. And I've discussed it before in one of my last program, but I'm going to repeat his words again. He said it in his presidential address to the Russian Federal Assembly, what some people are calling the State of the Union address. He's undoubtedly been briefed. These words were undoubtedly made following a private briefing which Putin was given of this conversation between these German officers. The Russians might indeed have other information going beyond this particular recording. I don't know. But anyway, Putin specifically said that the Western powers already are clearly considering attacks on their own, on Russia. He made the point that the Russians now themselves, well, that they're aware of the fact that there are missile strikes being planned against them. And he said that the Russians, if it does happen, they will respond. And his specific words about the Russian response, the fact that there would be a response, were to the effect that we remember what happened to those who sent their contingents to the territory of our country before. Today, any potential aggressors will face far graver consequences. They must grasp that we also have weapons. Yes, they know this, as I have just said, capable of striking targets on their territory. And he went on to say that the problem is that these are people who have never faced profound adversity. He's talking about the Western leaders. They have no conception of the horrors of war. We, even the younger generations of Russians, have endured such trials during the fight against international terrorism in the Caucasus and now in the conflict in Ukraine. But they continue to think of this as a kind of action cartoon. And then he went on to say that just like any other ideology promoting racism, national superiority, or exceptionalism, Russophobia is blinding and stupefying. And that he then says that if there is an attack, well, the Russians have defended themselves in the past, and they will defend themselves again. And as we saw, he said that they have the means to launch counterstrikes on the territories of the countries that are thinking about these attacks. And he has pointedly reminded people earlier in his address that the Russians have now completed development and have begun deployment of the Zircon hypersonic missile, which has now been combat tested. And of course, if the Germans launch strikes against, say, Krasnodar region, the Russians have the capability to launch counterstrikes on Germany itself, and Germany lacks the means to defend against them. And of course, in terms of the French troops or EU troops that might be sent to Ukraine, well, Putin again talks about the fate of aggressors and the fact that people who've involved themselves in Russian territory before have ended up being defeated. But we in fact know, because many Russian officials have said this in the past, that any Western combat troops who enter Ukraine, enter the area of the war zone, as far as the Russians are concerned, are targets. And again, the Russians have hypersonic missiles against which there is no defense and which have the range to reach any part of Ukraine. They would very quickly ascertain the presence of where these Western troops are, and the Western troops would very, very quickly suffer extremely heavy losses. And I'm going to say straight away that this, again, demonstrates the lunacy of this whole operation. You're talking about using up 50 missiles, Taurus missiles, to destroy a bridge, which you admit has no military utility, no military purpose. You are risking strikes against Russia itself, Krasnodar region, even as you're inviting counterstrikes upon yourself. Your own most senior general, one of the few level-headed people left, it sometimes seems to me, General Kuyat, has pointed out that the Taurus missiles cannot change the situation on the war, in the war. Others have said the same about the ATACMS missiles. They're not going to change the underlying dynamics of the war. And sending troops to Ukraine in the way that has been suggested, all that it will do will guarantee that they return, at least some of them, in body bags at a time when your own people are becoming increasingly disaffected. Now, I say all of this, we've just had an astonishing, bizarre, and entirely pointless interview on the part of the Financial Times with none other than General Milley, Mark Milley, the former chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. And he's asked, the only interesting point in this entirely vacuous interview, which makes me think, by the way, that General Milley is now thinking about a possible political career, but never mind. The only part of this interview where he says anything substantive is he's asked if the part of the problem in connection with Ukraine, the problems with Ukraine, is that Americans have just seen 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Milley replies, absolutely 100%, they've kind of had it with wars and forever wars. And that's Americans. Americans have had it with wars and forever wars. And that's true of Americans. I think there would be colossal opposition from the American public if any proposal were made to send American troops to fight in Ukraine. There is already opposition, mounting opposition to continued funding of this war. And add on top of that actual deployment of American forces to Ukraine. Well, I don't want to even try to estimate the level of opposition, but I expect it would be intense. And nonetheless, against the wishes of the French people, President Macron is talking about doing that with the French army and with other European armies. And they're contemplating strikes, deep strikes, against Russia itself. These are crazy plans by desperate people. And it needs to be understood that it is the desperation, the fact that the war is being lost, and that they can all see that, which is driving this thing. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn to the actual situation briefly on the battlefronts. Yesterday was one of the bloodiest days in the conflict in Ukraine since it started. Now, I don't have to hand the exact figures, but I understand that the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that something like 1,400 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded over the course of yesterday. And it's not difficult to see, again, where it is happening. The Ukrainians are rushing troops, apparently, to try to stem the collapse in the Avdiivka sector. The Russians, it now seems clear, are in essential control of the 3 villages Berdychi, Tonenka, and Orlovka. Orlovka apparently has now been fully cleared. Berdychi and Tonenka are about to be. The Russians are bombing Ukraine heavily. The bombs are falling on Ukrainian positions at extraordinary levels of intensity. Yesterday, Russian troops, this is in the Avdiivka sector, but right across the front lines, there are admissions that there are no proper defense lines. The that the Ukrainians can fall back on. There's a small river called, I believe, the Vovchansk. I may be getting its name wrong. That's some distance from where the Russians currently are. There's hurried attempts to try to build a defense line along this river. It's widely accepted that this defense line, once the Russians reach it, cannot be held for very long. And all of these troops that have been sent to the Avdiivka front lines by Ukraine to stem the collapse are being hammered away. The Russians are continuing to inflict, with their bombs and with their artillery, colossal damage upon them. And coming back to the point I've made many times, this is again another example of aggressive attrition. The Russians advance, the Ukrainians pile in men and machines to try to stem the Russian advance, and all that happens is that the Russians are able to pound those troops who are now largely out there in the open with bombs and artillery, inflicting colossal losses upon them. Something very similar appears to be happening in the Rabotino area, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the Russians are playing a cat and mouse game with the Ukrainians in Rabotino. It's the same kind of cat and mouse game we've seen them play in other places, including Avdiivka itself. They advance, the Russians advance, the Ukrainians then send reinforcements, they commit more of their reserves to try to prevent the collapse. The Russians are then in a perfect position to launch missile and bomb strikes and to deploy their terrifying TOS-1 flamethrowers against these troops, these Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainians suffer terrible losses. The Russians then go on the attack. They take more territory. The Ukrainians then throw in more reserves. They conduct another counterattack. The Russians retreat because they have no interest in holding grounds. It is more important to them to conserve forces. But the Ukrainian troops that conduct the counterattacks are then exposed to massive retaliation from the Russians, and the losses just go on piling up. And we see this in place after place right across the battle lines. It appears to be happening in Krasnodar as well, in the area near Marinka, though the Russians seem to be advancing increasingly in the Marinka sector, in Krasnogorivka itself. The Russians continue to destroy Ukraine's limited supply of air defense systems. We've had more pictures of another S-300 missile system, air defense system, being destroyed over the last few hours. Ukraine has been desperately trying to counter Russian air superiority, to hold back the bombing by deploying these huge, cumbersome air defense missiles, not designed, as I said, for movement along the battle lines, right to the combat line, to try to give its troops at least some degree of air cover. And that brings these air defense systems, which are in desperately short supply and cannot be replaced, within the range of Russian missile and artillery and drone strikes. And I think this is the second S-300 system that the Russians have destroyed within a 48 to 72 hour period. So we see the way the Russians pummeling the Ukrainians down. And further south, in Novomikhailivka, Russian troops have now raised their flag. It seems they control around 40% of Novomikhailivka. It looks as if Ukrainian defenses around Novomikhailivka are gradually collapsing. This is a fairly big village. It's not a town, it's a village apparently of around 1,400 people before the war began. So It's not a tiny place like some of the other villages we've been hearing about are. But anyway, the Russians are gradually gaining control of it. And on top of everything else, President Zelensky, together with the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, have apparently visited Kharkiv. Zelensky is now back in Ukraine, but notice again that he doesn't really want to be in Kiev for very long. Anyway, he's visited Kharkiv. And we now have comments from him advising Kharkiv residents not to return to the city, suggesting that the Ukrainians again expect a Russian attack on Kharkiv before long. There have been reports that the Ukrainians are hurriedly trying to create defenses around Kharkiv, a huge, sprawling city of, millions of people before the war. Difficult to capture, but also perhaps not entirely easy to defend with the resources that they have. And we've seen also that the Russians are disrupting Ukrainian logistics in this area by destroying bridges along the Oskol River line. So the Russians continuing to press forward. Their economy is remains strong, as I discussed in my program yesterday. There's no sign of any slackening in production numbers, especially in terms of military production. The Russians, their army is growing bigger all the time. Ukraine still hasn't passed its mobilization law. The amount of men that Ukraine could enlist is dwindling. So the trends in the war are clear. And that is why we're getting all these desperate and crazy plans. Strikes on Kharkiv, strikes against the Crimean Bridge, sending French troops and Western troops to Ukraine. All of these harebrained schemes to turn a situation round which cannot be turned round and which are only compounding the disaster. The one thing no one is prepared to do is do the obvious, which is to try to negotiate with the Russians. Now, there's been a fine article by Anatol Lieven and George Beebe. I say a fine article. It's a good article, and it's interesting and a humane article. It acknowledges that the war in Ukraine cannot be won and is being lost, and it nonetheless says that it's obviously massively in Ukraine's interest that there should now be a negotiated end to the war, but it's also in Russia's. And very interestingly, they make the same point that Eve Smith made recently in a brilliant article in Naked Capitalism. And I have to say, the rationale is so similar that, excuse me for saying this, I do wonder whether perhaps Beebe and Lieven have actually read Eve Smith's article. Just saying. But anyway, their point is that the Russians can push on, they can take the whole of Ukraine, they can conquer every part of it, but ultimately it might not be to their benefit in doing that. Because if the West refuses to accept the outcome, continues to support, let's say, a government in exile, engages in insurgency operations, then the Russians might be faced with an open-ended commitment in Ukraine, which could be colossally costly for them. So rather than face that, the Russians might see it as in their interests to come to some agreement and to achieve peace. There's been a very interesting article by another commentator who has pointed out the possible problem with this, which is that the Russians might feel that the plan is any kind of negotiations with the West simply are impossible now. The person in question is Paul Grenier, and he's written this in Russia Accord, and his point is that the Russians have now come to understand that diplomacy with the West is a futile exercise. They've tried it so many times. It has gone wrong on so many occasions that better to absorb the costs of winning the war rather than agree a compromise which the West won't honour. Well, that may be right. It may be that Grenier is absolutely right. And he writes, by the way, from the Simon Weil Center, and he works for something called the American Committee for US-Russia Accord. And he may be absolutely right. But why not try? Why not at least pick up the phone and talk to Putin or Lavrov, or offer to send people to Moscow, or to meet the Russians in Turkey, or do something like that? Why not do something? Oh, the Austrian Chancellor, who is facing a very difficult election, which he will probably lose, against the Freedom Party, who says exactly all of those things, and which is apparently opposed to sanctions, he has come out and said it. But none of the big European powers, not the United States, none of them are saying it. Instead, they're coming up with these crazy, disastrous schemes. All they are doing, it seems to me, is conveying to the Russians the sense of desperation that is starting to take hold in the West. The Russians have indicated what they will do. They will certainly, it seems to me, come after any Western troops that are deployed to Ukraine. Why wouldn't they? The idea of sending Western air forces into Ukraine to try to establish no-fly zones, by the way, running in the teeth of the Russian air defense system and the Russian Air Force, with air forces in Europe that are already in bad shape. The British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, has just had to announce the scrapping of 30 of its Typhoon fighter jets. I believe that's a third of the total, the operational total, because there is no means to refurbish them. The funding to refurbish them is simply not there. Anyway, the idea of establishing no-fly zones is a crazy one. It would fail, and again, it would almost certainly be rejected by the European public. And attacks on Krasnodar would be construed by the Russians as an act of war, and they are already talking about retaliatory steps. Putin himself has said that against NATO territory, which no NATO leader should disregard or risk, and senior NATO officials have already admitted that an attack on the Kerch Bridge would be unbelievably difficult, extremely costly, and would serve no useful military purpose. Desperation, panic, but a continued refusal to talk. Douglas MacGregor, I noticed, Colonel Douglas MacGregor, has recently taken to referencing that famous exchange between Marshal Rundstedt, I believe, Field Marshal Rundstedt and General Jodl in July 1944, after the Allies consolidated their positions in Normandy. Jodl telephoned Rundstedt from German headquarters and asked Rundstedt, "What can we do?" And Rundstedt said, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" By the way, that is a very, very free translation of his words, but that is the gist of what he said. Let's make peace or at least try. Let's put aside all these ludicrous ideas about domino theories in Europe, the Russians marching into Poland, and all that nonsense. Let's see whether perhaps it's possible to retrieve something from Ukraine. Eve Smith, Levin, and Beebe might be right. The Russians, tough-minded, practical, hard-headed people as they are, might decide, despite everything, that it's better to come to some kind of agreement that might not be fully satisfactory, but which gives them all that they want, all that they need, rather than allow their deep distrust of the West to push them forward further into territory they might not want. Who's to know? Let's try. Let's at least try in this situation and find out whether that is possible. The global majority, I'm going to start using that expression. I saw that Putin adopted it. For the record, the first person I heard use it was Jeffrey Sachs, just saying. But the global majority would undoubtedly support such a move if the West went about it sincerely and in earnest, and dropped Zelensky's ridiculous non-peace plan, which demands capitulation by Russia. That might weigh on the Russians as well. So why not try? But no, of course, we can't do that. That would be an unacceptable loss of face. It would spell the end of the unipolar order, the rules-based international order, which is, of course, the same as the unipolar system, would finally collapse. It would admit that we can't prevail against the Russians or indeed anyone else. Instead, we must look for harebrained, crazy solutions, like attacks on a bridge that has symbolic but no military purpose, attacks on the territory of the world's biggest nuclear power, deployment of troops into a war zone where they can't be protected. We must come up with fantastic, grotesque, ludicrous, mad, inhuman plans like that, because we can't bring ourselves to admit that we were wrong. I've never known a period in European history when things were so bad, at least not in my lifetime. Perhaps in Germany in 1944 or 1945, it was the same. But that is the only comparison I can think of. Fortunately, the Russians are not aiming to conquer Europe, but the tragedy of Ukraine grows worse and deeper by the day. Well, this is where I end my program. More from me soon. Let me remind you that you can find all my programs on my various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again soon. More from me soon. Have a very good day.